Hello, this is David Collister with Time to Remember, another in our series of programmes examining island life in the 20th century. The voice of today's guest will be familiar to listeners who take an interest in Manx politics. He was a member of Tynwald for some 17 years, often regarded as a thorn in the flesh of 4 administrations over that period. He's Edgar Quine. Richard Edgar Quine, to give him his full name, born on the 16th of August 1934 at Ballacreban in Andros. But he joins me not to talk politics or even about his distinguished career in the Hong Kong police. In this half hour, we hear about some of his escapades during his youth. Shortly after he retired from the House of Keys last year, I went to talk to him at his home in Sulby, and I asked him what kind of memories he had of his early days.
Very fond ones, really. I mean, I'm very much... I'm a country lad, you know. I was born and brought up in the country. My parents and grandparents were from Andros and Smale, and obviously it goes without saying that I started out prior to the Second World War somewhat, so I have recollections of life as it was before the Second World War, and life as it was coming through the Second World War with rationing and blackouts and all that sort of thing.
What do you remember of your grandparents and your parents?
Well, on both sides, on my grandmother's side and my grandfather, in fact, they were essentially crofters. They were crofters. My grandmother on my father's side was out at Outer Ballacale, out at the Gobgorum, or I think now we tend to refer to it as Blue Point. On my mother's side, of course, they were crafting down at Gatawing, which is in the Smale area. Mm. So I spent a lot of time with them. We used to go out and spend time with them, and of course we were totally absorbed with all the things that went on around us there.
Your father was quite athletic, wasn't he, from the pictures I'm seeing here of him with his bicycle?
Yes, father was athletic. I've not inherited very much of that, David, I'm afraid. I'm a kind of an armchair sportsman. But my father was a well-known cyclist, and he, in fact, won the Isle of Man cycling TT in 1926 and 1928. And as you saw, we've got 2 Grand Cups here, which are solid silver cups, presented by the Dunlop Company. And so cycling in those days, you really had to be extremely fit because, of course, you didn't have all the modern bicycles. And getting around the TT course, because it was a TT course-based race.
How many laps would that be? Just the one?
It would just be the one lap.
Yes.
But I mean, my father worked on the farms, and I remember him explaining to me, you know, just what the total setup was. I mean, he was working on a farm at Bride. On the race day, he would work until 11 o'clock in the morning before the farmer would let him off.
Right.
Then he would then cycle into Ramsey, put his bicycle on the train, go up to Douglas, then go do the race round the TT course, and then in the evening after the presentations lads would have a drink and they would cycle all the way back to the north of the island. And I think it was the first year that he won, it'd be 1926. I remember him explaining to us that he cycled into Ramsey, missed the train, cycled over the mountain, and then did the TT race and then cycled back again in the evening. Now, if that's not dedication to your sport, I don't know what is.
Well, presumably had good training at working on farms then, did he?
Oh, yes. He spent, he was really a farm work. Well, he was a farm worker for most of his life.
Like a hired farm worker?
Absolutely. He was a hired farm worker. I mean, in latter years, when the number of people working on the farms dwindled a bit, he had a spell when he used to walk the Highway Board stallion. He used to walk from farm to farm around the island with the Highway Board stallion. He had a number of years when he worked on the thrashing mill, Crennel's Mills. But essentially he was a farmer. Of course, if you, and I might add, a ploughman, and that is where you'd get your fitness.
Yes.
If you were going to walk behind a horse and plough all day, it was excellent training for to be a cyclist.
And where were you born yourself then?
Well, I was born in Bellacreban when my father was working in Bellacreban. Bellacreban, of course, as you will know, is down in Andreas. But of course, at that time, farm workers were hired and fired, as part of the Hollantide Fair. And so you moved from farm to farm. So I was born in, I say, at Bellacreban. Then, of course, following father moved along, and we all moved with him. I went to Bellawain. I lived at Bellawain, Belladool, Bellacorey, Bellakillia, Bellavere, Bellavari, and so we went on almost year by year. We moved from farm to farm.
Well, up to what age would that be?
Well, all the moves that I've just mentioned were completed before I was 11. They were completed before I was 11.
Did you find it all confusing, or did it not matter? Well,
It was nothing out of the usual. I'd never known anything else. But I mean, in latter years, when I've sat through debates and heard people talking about how important it is for children to have a stable background and not to interrupt their education, I have reflected that perhaps it's surprising that I got as far as I did, because I had excellent parents. They were very committed to us. But, I mean, the social circumstances were such that there's no way that I had a stable background. We were forever on the move, changing schools, changing Sunday schools, changing homes. And my mother was the most expert decorator. You can just imagine the number of houses and rooms that she's decorated. It was fantastic.
Were you using pen and ink?
Oh, no. Pen and ink was for for the older students. When I started at the door, we used to get a bit of slate and a piece of chalk. And a piece of chalk. Yeah. And I was just telling some kiddies recently when I visited Alden School, and they thought this was quite hilarious. We get a slate and a piece of chalk, because I think the idea was that young children, it wasn't sensible for them to waste paper. So we got this bit of chalk. And I remember for PT too at the Doer School, we used to get a little rattan mat, which would be about 18 inches wide at the most and maybe 3 foot long. And we'd do our PT. We used to put this little rattan mat down on the floor and do somersaults and our exercises lying on it. And that was the substitute gym.
Right.
We had gas masks. There were drills for that. We used to get, of course, cod liver oil, and we would get out picking rose hips for the war effort.
Yeah.
I mean, the cod liver oil we used to get, of course, we all get lined up and get a spoonful of cod liver oil. And unless you were first in the queue, I'm afraid the spoon that you got your cod liver oil on was the same spoon as most of the others got their cod liver oil from. But it didn't seem to make any difference to us anyway.
Hygiene was quite different in those days, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Even in the home and so on.
Well, if you take sort of a home, I mean, we would be. Oh, I'm just trying to think about the years, but I mean, it would be in the late 1940s before we had pipe water in any house that we lived in, and certainly a little later than that before we had electricity. And again, I recollect we lived in a thatched cottage. It was Ohio Cottage down in Andreas, and my great-grandmother used to live with us at that time. And I remember this vividly. We had a local preacher coming to visit her, and of course, as was always the case, everybody must have a cup of tea. But the water, of course, was kept in this earthenware jar, big earthenware jar out in the back, on earthen floors. There was no boards in this cottage. And we all had a cup of tea. Mother had gone out and she had filled up the kettle, taken the water from this earthenware jar into the kettle, boiled the kettle, and we all sat down to have a tea and biscuit, and that was fine. Everybody had a cup of tea and a biscuit, and it went down great. Anyway, the teapot subsequently became empty, and Mother grabbed the kettle to see if there was a need to replenish, to replenish the teapot. And lo and behold, although there was obviously water in the kettle, no water would come out of the kettle. The lid was removed, and inside the kettle, well cooked, was a mouse. and I can assure you, any sort of thought of anybody having a second cup of tea of that, it disappeared fast.
When you went to these various schools then, presumably it was 3 R's you were learning, basic education.
Yes, and not much more than that. Obviously, they covered geography and history, but I mean, it was founded on the 3 R's. That there was very little change in the syllabus, I think, from my father's time. But I mean, that the approach to it, or at least the approach I experienced, and in part that's probably because I was one that needed to be driven a little, was that the teachers used to say, well, I'm going to teach you, even if I have to sort of half kill you to get you there. And they were really strict. Yeah. And I remember at Andrews, we had a lovely little teacher called Miss Sale, who had taught my father. And she would walk up and down the classroom looking over our shoulder while we were doing our lessons. And if we had a mistake, which was more often than not, she used to grab you by the short hairs above the ear and give them a severe tug, kind of a form of torture. And, this went on so frequently, really, that we were almost bald above the ear, where she used to grab us by the hair and give it a tug. But as we got used to this, and as we grew taller, of course, the secret was to get up on your feet when she was getting a grip on the hair by the side of your ear, so as you took the leverage off, and it wasn't quite as painful.
You're listening to Time to Remember on Manx Radio, and today I'm talking to Edgar Quine, not about politics or police matters, but about his rural beginnings as the son of a farm worker. Life in the country when Edgar was growing up was a lot more basic than it is today.
I think I was 15 years old and had left school before the National Health Service came in. So, I mean, I went through my childhood without the support of a National Health Service. The health service as we know it today didn't exist. But, people got by. I mean, life in the country, of course, was in many ways, compared to today, would be rough and ready. I mean, people would be using, very rarely they try to avoid, should we say, using coal and the cost of coal. I mean, they would be using gorse bones, as we would call it, and logs for fires. Yeah. And again, I have a fond memory of visiting a friend of my father's when I was a little lad, and he used to cut gorse bones off until they were about 4 foot long, 3 foot, 4 foot long, and he would shove them up the chimney and they would burn their way down. and this used to amuse me no end. And again, when you'd be sitting there at night, and when it would come to sort of supper time, as you'd call it, he would go out to the back kitchen and he'd get himself a couple of salt herring. They had not been soaked in water, and today we have all these dire warnings about not taking too much salt. Yeah. He would get his salt herring, he would put it onto a bit of twisted wire that he had, and he would toast the herring over the fire. And I remember this particular night, he was sitting there toasting the herring, and he had the old cat sitting on his lap. And when the herring was done to a turn, as we would say, he brought it back, and he was about to remove the herring from this toasting rack that he had. But the old cat was quicker than he was. And the cat sprang, grabbed the herring, and was just about to leave his knee when he grabbed the cat by the tail. And I have this picture of the cat with the herring in its mouth, our friend with the cat's tail, and he was sort of whacking the cat around the head to make the cat drop the herring. Ultimately, of course, the cat dropped the herring. He picked it up. It had lost nothing, and he carried on with his supper.
Yeah, well, I mean, the herring was a vital part of existence, really, wasn't it?
Oh yes, I mean there's herring. Herrings, of course, were very important. I don't know how many herrings I've eaten in my life.
Yeah.
And of course rabbits and wood pigeons and things like that. I mean rabbit was a very important part of the diet as well. You could always get a rabbit.
Were you catching rabbits?
Oh yes, I mean this was one of our nice little earners because particularly during the war years, I mean there was a big market for rabbits, and you could get if you could lube rabbits, as we used to call, catch them with the snares, and if you were able to lamp rabbits, which was another way to get a good number of rabbits, you could do very well indeed. There was no, but of course it was the war years, and it was illegal to go out and catch rabbits, by light, even if you had the farmer's permission.
Yeah.
But I do remember with my elder brother and my father, and this was during the war years, we were catching out with the light, catching rabbits up in Mackle, and we were returning home. We were coming across the new Mackle churchyard. It was new in the sense it was just being developed at that time. I'm talking about 1941, 42, something like that. And we were going to cross the churchyard, and of course we're in the dark, because of course we had already extinguished the old carbide lamp. That had been put out.
You got a few rabbits with you, hadn't you?
Oh, we were loaded with rabbits. Father was loaded down with rabbits. My elder brother, who was ahead of me walking, was loaded with rabbits. I was carrying rabbits, and we were all a bit nervy, walking across this churchyard in the dark, and we were halfway across it, and there was an almighty banging noise, clunk, clunk, and I thought my end had come. I thought at least there was a ghost going to jump up and grab me. Nearly died. And transpired that what it was, they had dug a grave for the next day, and they had put a sheet of galvanized over the top of the grave. Father, being in the front, had trod on it and had given this big clunk clunk noise, and my brother and I nearly dropped dead coming back with all our load of rabbits.
But in the country, presumably you had plenty of eggs, you had vegetables, you had plenty of milk as well. You wouldn't have gone short.
No, well, we certainly had a distinct advantage over those that lived in the town, because we had the ability, through gardens or through an arrangement with a farmer where your father may work, to grow a few potatoes, and you could keep some hens and get some eggs, etc. So we had that advantage, probably an advantage to say over those that lived in the towns, and we would be going up on the farms and helping out, etc. I remember we, again, I have a recollection of this with a friend of mine who's now departed, unfortunately. We used to go to a local farm to get our milk, and we would have an enamel can each, and we would go up onto the street and we would go knock on the door. Well, ostensibly we'd go and help with the milking, and then we would go in to see the dear old lady, the farmer's wife, and get our milk.
Yeah.
And I have this picture, and my friend and I used to often think about this and reflect on it. We'd go into the dairy, and she would say, "Come in, boys, we'll get you milk." And she was a lady probably about my age, but she seemed old at the time. And the milk that she was going to dish out, again, was in an earthenware jar, and she would have a bumper, again, as we call it, a jug with a long handle on it, and a measured sort of thing. And she'd take our enamel jugs, and she would go to this jar, and she'd lean over it to get our measure of milk. But she had a misfortune that she always had a drop on the end of her nose, no matter whether it was summertime or wintertime. It was almost as if it was plastic. It was there. And she would lean over the jar, and we were about 10, 11-year-olds, the most, and we would stand there we couldn't take our eyes off this, because we were in fear that it would be dislodged when she was scooping our milk from the jar, But it never seemed to come off. It never seemed to get dislodged, and we would get our milk, breathe a sigh of relief, and hasty retreat home. But public health wasn't the hygiene.
That's what I said earlier. No, hygiene wasn't quite the same.
No, quite different.
Well, did you get far from home then? I mean, we were in just this small area near your home all the time, were you? Or?
No, we were generally around the village. I mean, when we were, say in our 5, 6, 7, 8, we'd walk up to our grandparents up at Smale and up at the Len, so well, Gobgorum as I call it. And there was a sweet shop at Smale Corner, and we used to have a penny or something to go in there to get some sweets on our way up to grandmother's. And an old lady ran the shop, and she never used brown paper bags. She always used like cornet-shaped bits of newspaper which had been shaped into cornets.
Yes.
And she would shove all these cornets in a long roll, and when you went in to get your sweets, she of course had to dislodge a cornet-shaped bag to put your sweets in. So she would open she'd grab this long collection of bags, and then she would blow profusely, blow into these bags to try to dislodge one. And when she would dislodge one, she would then put a hand in the jar and scoop you out some sweets, But again, I mean, we think of all our hygiene rules and regulations today, but this was par for the course.
What about if you went to baker shops, butcher shops, grocers and so on? I mean, there was a lot of handling with those as well.
Oh yes, but again, very, very rough and ready. I mean, there was 2 bakers, to my recollection, that used to come round the country with a horse and cart, and latterly, of course, with vans. So you'd get your bread from.
But it was pretty fresh, wasn't it?
Oh, very, very fresh indeed. Yeah. And out in Andres, where we lived, of course, there was a butcher there. He subsequently had a shop in Ramsey, but I mean, I do recollect he used to be making brawn out in the street. He had it was a kind of a cast iron boiler with an open fire underneath it, and he would boil up all the bits of meat to make the brawn. And sort of a standing joke was that he would, put sheep's heads and things like that in. And I say the joke was that he used to leave the eyes in to see you through the week, sort of situation,
The rural toilet arrangements were never much more than primitive, were they?
No, very, very primitive. I know latterly we were living at Bullavolly at Ballaugh, where the wildlife park is there now, but it was a gatehouse for the railway then. And so that would go into the late 40s, early 50s, and it was still a question of a thigh bag down the garden, and that's well into the 50s. Yeah. And, I mean, if you were upmarket, if you had a single-seater or a double-seater, some of them used to have capacity for 2 on the one seat.
I've seen a triple somewhere, where there was 2 adult and 1 small one for a child.
That must have been upmarket, David, because I recollect that we thought that we were upmarket with having 2, 1 for the child and 1 for the adult.
This is a communal activity that seems to have passed out.
Well, it certainly does. I mean, Iris had not been heard of. I mean, I don't think there was anything to any sort of. Iris hadn't. Well, it certainly hadn't been heard of. But irises wouldn't grow very well down there. But I assure you, we had terrific rhubarb.
And pocket money. I mean, you said you used to go and get presumably a bit of money from rabbits, but you wouldn't get much in the way of pocket money either, would you?
Oh no, you wouldn't. You would not from your parents. You get very, very little from them. But there were other ways. I mean, I mentioned my father used to work on Crenell's thrashing mill. And of course, when they were going around from farm to farm thrashing, I mean, we used to follow them around during the weekends and holiday. If there was a holiday, we would be with them. And of course, the little earner at that time was, of course, that the longtails, when they were thrashing, the longtails would be shooting out of the stacks. And if you had a good dog, you would get a good number of longtails. And there was a bounty system in being then here in the Isle of Man for longtails. And if you caught a female longtail, that was fourpence. You could get fourpence bounty on a female longtail, and you could get tuppence on a male longtail. The point being that you had to take the whole body, so to speak, up to the blacksmith if you were going to claim the fourpence. If you just produced a tail, you only got tuppence.
Cool.
So we would be out at the weekend, we'd be catching longtails, and then, of course, we had to get them to the blacksmith to get our bounty. Now, when we were going to school on a Monday morning, of course, we couldn't hand them in then because there was no the smithy wasn't open.
Right.
So we used to have this parcel, newspaper parcel, with the bodies and the tails wrapped up in newspaper, and we would get into school. And we used to hide them in the cloakroom. We used to hide them in the cloakroom until we were going home, and then we would trade them in then, you know.
Dear, dear. Were you ever caught doing that?
I don't remember us being caught. I think it was we were pretty deft at hiding them. You know, we were pretty good at hiding them. But it was a nice little earner. 4p and 2p we used to get.
It must have made some difference to your sense of smell as well.
No. Well, I think we grew up with it. It didn't seem to bother us, you know.
Yeah.
But again, talking about the longtails, and I hope I'm not putting your listeners off here, but there was a chap who used to drive the thrashing mill with Father, and I remember this day he was sitting in our house, and of course working on the mill he would have pockets full of binder twine, and he was sitting in the house this day, and he produced this old brown paper bag out of his pocket, and he had a few Manx knobs left in this bag. And
these are sweets, of course. Yeah.
I beg your pardon. Yes, sweets. Yes, and he was dishing them out, and there was one to go to Mother, and there was one for my brother and I, and my brothers. I think, yes, we were all at home, and eventually he ran. The bag was empty, and he said, "Oh, it's all right." We were a bit concerned that he hadn't left one for himself. He said, "No," he said, "I've got one here somewhere," and he puts his hand into his pocket, and he pulls out a handful of binder twine, which were from the mill, and he starts searching through the binder twine, searching through it, and then halfway through the search, he finds a long tail that had been cut off.
All right.
So he transfers that to his other pocket, carries on with the search, found the missing Manx knob, and everybody was happy.
Some of Edgar Quine's memories of childhood days. During that same visit, we also spoke at some length about his career in the Hong Kong police force, during which he received numerous decorations, most notably the OBE in 1982. His involvement during the period of the Cultural Revolution, the many riots, and how thousands of illegal immigrants were being dealt with on a daily basis will be the subject of a future programme. But that's all from this edition of Time to Remember.